Hello there. In this video, we're going to learn a little bit about making environments in Blender for concept art, like this one. Also, a quick disclaimer, this video is a shortened version of the full course available over on Gumroad. With that out of the way, let's get started. First, I think we need to establish what really is environment concept art, because it's really become this umbrella term for a whole bunch of things. But the way I like to break it down is into illustrations, key shots, and overviews, where illustrations are for marketing or public use. Key shots is the environment shown from potentially different angles in a rougher state to use in-house to develop the environment further. And overviews includes maps and the general layout of the area, where composition and storytelling is less important. And for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll be doing something like a key shot. Like always, you need to have some sort of idea of what it is you're doing. And for me, I am building something sci-fi. But then I've also added these additional words to the build just to give it some flavor. And those are exotic, luxurious, and corrupt. So it's going to be this high-class society with a little bit of gangster vibes to it, maybe some casino vibes. Which probably won't be able to see too much, but that's at least what I'm imagining, and it will help inform that decision making. And also it's super key to gather good reference. I've gathered both some architectural reference for the architecture in the piece and some environmental reference for the nature, and then overall just some mood pieces to help guide in the right direction. And as always, I am using PureRef to gather all my reference. Jumping into Blender, the first thing I do is actually start sketching using the grease pencil. This is of course something you could do in Photoshop or in a different software, but there's something nice about just getting into Blender and just using grease pencil, then quickly switching over to doing the modeling afterwards. And here I'm sketching out the preliminary architecture, so I have some ideas for the architecture based on my reference, and sort of these rounded structures with kind of domed tops. And I'm imagining a little bit of Middle Eastern reference and some Ottoman reference. And I'm trying to weave all these things together. And I'm trying out different things. And I'm not trying too many different types of structures, as I really want to explore the architectural style. And all this could very much change in the 3D. And I don't always do this process, but for here I was doing multiple buildings. So it just kind of made sense to do these architectural design. And it actually ended up being really helpful. I quite like starting out with the architecture first, because it gives me the confidence that the architecture is interesting in itself. So once I put into the environment, I can kind of take that off to the side and just trust that it works. And also it fits in with my narrative that this alien civilization has come to this area and put down their architectural style in this environment. Sometimes you have the opposite happen, right, where you're designing something to fit the environment, but here I wanted a strong cultural style for the architecture, so it became this way. And here I've created a little assortment of architectural sketches. Something else I tried while doing this project was drawing out a sort of map for the environment. So this is before starting to block out the 3D itself, and it's just sort of put in to perspective what I had in mind for the area. And I could even grab some of the little grease pencil strokes and move them into three-dimensional space to fill out the volume a little bit to help guide when I then start going into 3D. So jumping into 3D, what I started doing there was grabbing, cylinders and started to block out the architecture itself. And this took a little bit of time because I had to get the first volume mass right. And just figuring out the divisions, and I think I ended up using some pretty standard ideas in architecture, especially this concept of rising detail, which you see a lot in sort of classical architecture, Roman classical architecture, where things will get smaller and more detailed when you go towards the top. It also helps emphasize scale, because it's almost a trick of perspective, right? You're going higher and higher up, and suddenly the details are getting smaller and smaller than they should be, so their building appears a little bit bigger and more grandiose. And I think that fits quite well with this idea of these luxurious gangsters who's maybe trying to overdo each other with who can build the biggest building or something like that. In terms of ornamentation and materials and all these things, I definitely thought the building should be white and they should have these domed copper roofs, as we see in sort of European classical architecture. And then sort of ornated with these gold things, which was a little bit of a mix between some Middle Eastern references and some European influences. And I think this merging of architectures worked quite well. The difficult part was making it more sci-fi. And I think I left that to the ornamentation and some of the decoration, just making everything a little bit more angled here and there. And then the ornamentation should almost look like a 3D printer made it and not follow any sort of conventional patterns, but a more futuristic pattern or something. I also wanted a sense of life in the building, so I created these little strips of light that I placed around the different heights of the building to simulate light. And it was a really easy way to add that sense of life. And I really wanted to create an assortment of different structures, and then the idea was that I would then combine them in the city, so we feel like they have a similar cultural architectural style, but still different architects maybe are involved. And I think this really helps sells the believability of the area. My general technique for these things is actually just to build what I think is interesting, and then when I start blocking them out, then maybe some things work and some things don't, and that's totally fine. But I tend to use, 75% of it. But sometimes there's a building that just doesn't fit. Here, for example, you can see all the buildings laid out, and we had this more organic, very strange building, and it was based on one of the sketches that I really liked, but I didn't really hit it in 3D. And I decided I didn't have enough time to continue, and I liked the other building so much more, so it never ended up getting used. But it was worth the exploration. Then I started building some forest patches, little nature assets for the more organic and natural parts of the environment. So I created these little balls of kind of foresty things. They're not actually trees, they're just supposed to represent trees, right? But I combined them together into these little patches, and from afar they ended up really looking like little forest patches, so that was quite neat. And then I combined them with these hill areas, and the idea here was really just to create some different assets for the environment to use afterwards. I also grabbed some scan data from online. These are really useful because they just give you so much information, variation, and natural feel for free. I highly recommend looking for scan data online, or grabbing things like from the Megascans library. When I finally got around to doing the blockout, I looked at my map reference especially, and I had all my assets that I prepared over on the left side here in the new asset browser. And then I just started blocking everything out. I started with the big kind of water land masses. I knew I wanted a lot of water to make everything very exotic. And the overall idea for this environment was to have a sort of castle city, or like a little, luxurious city sitting at the edge of a waterfall, and it would kind of be in that like crevice of the waterfall, and all this water would come down from the sides, and they would have this amazing view from the waterfall. And to really block everything out to begin with, I created a quick water shader, and then I grabbed some of my hill assets that I had built, just simple assets, and then I kind of supplied that and supported that with some scan data, especially this little patch with a variation of fields and forests. That helped create a lot of organic shapes and lines. And the nice thing about this specific patch was that it had a little bit of road on it, some human-made road, and that gave it a sense that like sentient beings had been here and kind of manipulated some of the area around, which we see quite often in our own world, right? We have these unnatural straight lines where suddenly then there's a field. When I was done with that, then I started pulling in the city assets, and there I pulled in the main tower first, and then I created this little block shape, this little wedge shape, and that one I used to just scatter throughout the environment. I generally think it's a really nice technique to create very few assets and then reuse those assets as much as possible, because they create a sense of coherency in the architecture, if that's what you're going for in your design. For me that was, but even just taking those little architectural pieces and placing them kind of asymmetrically along each other gives a lot of dynamicness to the levels of the city and makes the city feel more organic, but still the architecture kind of fits together. So I really, really like this technique. It was super useful. And here I was, after having done most of the block out, I blocked out the entirety of the city just using the same techniques that we talked about before. Ended up really liking looking around the city, and already at this point I started imagining the different shots or the different angles I wanted to capture the city from. And this is really the level of detail I would want to push the city to before starting getting into the next segment, which is finding those angles. So when your environment is ready and you have the detail you want and you're ready for the next step, that's when you can start creating a camera and then start to find those key shots that we're looking for. And I think a really useful technique here is trying to think of the key shots as a set of cinematic shots, right? So how would you see these shots in a film? For me, I imagine kind of how would it be like to approach this environment in a film? So probably we would see maybe an establishing shot first, big wide shots, we see the entire city, and then we start getting closer. So the technique I used here was creating little keys on the cameras, and then I'm slowly moving in towards the city, and I'm creating several keys and several different options for each of those types. So there's a landing shot, right, a big open shot, and then maybe something a bit more close, a bit more intimate with the city, and then something really close where we even start seeing the people and we're moving to where the action is. So I'm creating several versions of these shots in my keys here, and it just helps me keep track of what I have, and I can go back and forth really quick and see what works for me and what doesn't work. So I think it's a really useful technique for those things. It obviously depends on what kind of environment are you doing. If you're doing something maybe more for a game and you're not super interested in showing the cinematic approach to your city, then perhaps you want to find those key areas, right? And I would still use the same technique. You maybe saying, okay, I want to show off where the bank is, or where the main tower is. Then create different keys with different shots of where you can show off that environment, because every environment is different, and there's unique angle for every environment that works. There's always the standard ones, like having a low camera and then pointing slightly up and then showing the grandiosity of the environment, or you can have something more above where you see everything very clear. For me personally, I really found that this technique opens up doing environment concept art so much more, because I really get to act like a photographer, which I find a lot more intuitive with environments especially. After this step, finding your angles, that's when you can then bring in, the secondary steps for the cinematography here, and that is, the big strokes of light. So what I do here is just add a directional light, and then exactly the same thing with the camera. I establish those keyframes for the directional light also. So I'm stepping through all my cameras, and then I'm adjusting the direction light for each, so I can make those big transitions between light and dark. And it's just a really fun way, because you've established so many things and you just get to light these nice angles you already made. And because it's so fast, then even if I created 16 key shots, then it's super fast to just rotate the direction light on all of them, and then once I can see all of them in the end, then I can make a really informed decision based on those 16. If I just need to choose 4 or something, then I have all this information with the light and the camera angles and so on. And here was definitely trying to create some kind of evening light with a little bit more of an orangey sun and these more purplish kind of shadows. I also added some clouds because they also really help add and shape the light in conjunction with the directional light there. So that worked really well with just having a transparent plane and some cloud texture on it there. And it was just super fun seeing the environment come to life with the shadows as well. Alright, after kind of having established this cinematography on all, 16 shots, then I thought, okay, I want to start choosing some things, so I'll go over everything with the grease pencil once again, and just very roughly sketch out what could be better, what could I add, and which shots do I really like. So starting nailing down the decision process and planning some things ahead for what I might do in Photoshop. And this technique was really, really helpful. It made the decision process so much easier because I had all that info that I might would have to explore in Photoshop afterwards, but having it already there in the 3D environment, kind of so close to where everything is, it just made it so much faster and was super fun and helped connect everything to the final image. After I'd done the sketch over for all the key shots, I had to, do a little bit of a selection process, and that was quite difficult because I ended up liking a lot of the shots. But it really did come down to those initial statements of what's the story, what am I trying to do with this, environment, what needs to be framed. And here the hypothetical scenario was that we need to show off this environment, sort of pitch the environment. Like this should be the overall feel of the place. So I'm looking for those shots that not show the specific buildings because those things would have been selected yet, but showing off what does it feel like, this environment. Is this the right fit for this culture? After having picked the final roster of key shots, then I went in to do some of the render settings. And I was working in eevee here, so I was definitely turning on stuff like ambient occlusion and screen sprays, reflections. And there's also some other settings that I was playing around with in eevee, but those are really the main two that can do a lot. I was also trying out rendering in cycles, which definitely makes everything look a lot better, especially with those little lights I had in the different towers. They look really good in cycles, and the sense of global illumination is just a lot more powerful in cycles. But I was rendering out multiple images, and the result I got from eevee was pretty good. And it's really, you end up picking your battles here. What, takes longer to change in 3D and what is faster to do in 2D. And for me, I really wanted fast renders because I was doing several. And those little, details in the lights, I could always easily add those in 2D. And working in eevee is also quite nice because everything feels quite CG, and that means I'm forced a little bit to paint when I get into Photoshop. And I actually like that I have to give everything a pass with the brushstroke before it kind of works. So it's a nice little compromise there. And the final things I prepared from Blender before moving into Photoshop was really the render passes. If you don't know about render passes are really more used for CG and compositing, but they can actually be used as nice utility passes in Photoshop for selecting things. And you can get some really nice render passes that can help you with atmospheres, selecting the different areas, ambient occlusion, and big differences between light and shadow. And I definitely found those really, really, really useful in Photoshop. And I highly recommend you to look into those and how to use those and experiment with using also the compositor and what you can get out of Blender. For me personally, I've created a little automatic workflow where I always get out these compositing render passes for me to use in Photoshop, because I'm so dependent on them now. They're so useful, and it's almost a need to have at this point. And also with my setup, then I get all those render passes for each of the different camera angles, and so when I'm processing everything in Photoshop, I get a really consistent workflow for each of the shots to make them all feel a little bit more coherent. So once I'm actually in Photoshop, then I start processing all of my render passes. And by processing, I mean I put them into a sort of structure, similar to sort of foreground, middle ground, and background. I also have some layers for specifically the atmosphere, and some for the big light and shadow parts of the image. This is super helpful to keep my process clean. After that, then I really want to start focusing on these more CG looking parts of the image, like especially the left and right banks here, the cliffs. I want to start filling them out with some photo bashing. So I find images in photo libraries or online and start building out those areas. My plan is really to have, waterfall come over, but building this nice base of stone and cliff really helps with that afterwards. I also really want to tackle the big sky up there. That's a big part of the overall impression of the image, and there really try to find something that is as close to final as possible. And here you can see me start building in those big waterfalls, and I'm also adding some lights, and this is really where those render passes come in super handy, because they help establish the different areas and lets me keep everything super separated. And I'm also building out some foliage and just adding details to the image to make it feel exotic and the way I wanted, and overall just bringing the final touches to the image. And here we have the final image, a bit more romantic than what I thought first, but I think it's pretty close to what I was envisioning. Now that is pretty much the end for this tutorial. If you wish to learn more, you can check out our full course over on Gumroad, Environment Concept Art in Blender. There we go through the entirety of everything you just saw, just in 14 chapters and in much more detail. Check it out over on Gumroad. If you like this video, leave a like. If you want to see more from us, subscribe. And otherwise, I thank you guys so much for watching, and bye!